I want to talk about self-regulatory focus theory and how the actions of leaders can affect the way followers approach different situations. Self-regulatory focus theory is a theory developed by Torrey Higgins. He says that a person's focus at any given time is to either approach pleasure or avoid pain. These are two basic motivations that each and every one of us has, and they cause us to have different kinds of goals. Promotion goals in different life situations emphasize achievement. Prevention goals are oriented towards the avoidance of punishment. In a specific situation, our thoughts might focus more on promotion goals or more on prevention goals. The theory suggests that two factors affect which goals we are focusing on. First, there is a chronic factor. This factor is connected to a person's personality and says that each person has a basic tendency to either focus more on promotion goals or focus more on prevention goals as part of his or her personality. Second, there is a situational factor, which means that the context we are in can make us more likely to focus on one set of goals or the other. For example, we are more likely to be thinking about pleasure and to have promotion goals when we are spending time with a friend. In contrast, if we are working on an important project for our boss, we are more likely to try to avoid making mistakes and therefore have more prevention goals in our mind. Research has shown that the goals we are focusing on at a given time affect the way we think. For example, when focusing on promotion goals, people consider their ideal self, their aspirations and gains. They don't think about what they can lose, so they think in a happier mode. They feel more inspired to change. When people are focusing on prevention goals, they think about their ought self. What are they supposed to be? What are people expecting from them? They consider their obligations to others. As a result, they experience more anxiety and try to avoid situations where they could lose. Now that I have talked about the two focuses and how they affect people, I want to look at the idea that the way leaders behave, or their style of leading, can affect the focus that followers adopt in a specific situation. In talking about leadership, we often mention transformational leaders and transactional leaders. Transformational leaders, when interacting with their followers, focus on their development in their words and actions. Transformational leaders highlight change. Their speech is passionate and conveys a definitive vision. All of these things can encourage followers to think about what could be. In other words, they inspire a promotion focus in their followers. In contrast, transactional leaders focus on developing clear structures, tell their followers exactly what is expected of them. While they do explain the rewards people will get for following orders, they emphasize more how a follower will be punished, or that a follower won't get rewarded if his or her behavior doesn't change. In short, they emphasize the consequences of making a mistake. This emphasis will clearly lead followers to focus on avoiding punishment and problems. This is clearly a prevention focus. In conclusion, it is important to understand that one focus is not necessarily better than the other one. For a designer who works in a field where a lot of innovation is needed, a promotion focus is probably better. In contrast, a prevention focus, which causes people to work more cautiously and produce higher quality work, might be very appropriate for a job like a surgeon, for example. The main point of the research, though, is that the actions of leaders can greatly influence whether people approach a situation with more of a promotion focus or more of a prevention focus.
I've been talking to managers in a number of businesses and reading surveys about the future of management. And what I'm going to present in this seminar is a few ideas about how the activity is likely to change in the next 10 years. It isn't a scientific statistical analysis, just some ideas for us to discuss. One area I want to mention is business markets, and I'm sure a really significant development will be a major increase in competition, with companies from all around the world trying to sell similar products. Consumers will have much more choice. For instance, food products sold in Australia might be manufactured in the USA, China, Finland, and dozens of other countries. At the same time, mergers and takeovers mean that governments are actually losing power to major global corporations. We can probably all think of companies that exert a great deal of influence, which may be good for consumers. A third point I want to make about markets is that in the rapidly expanding economies, such as India, China, Brazil, and Russia, demand is growing very fast. This is putting pressure on resources all over the world. I think businesses are becoming more open to external influences. In particular, companies are consulting customers more and more before making their business decisions. Companies are finding out what they want and providing it, instead of making products and then trying to sell them, which is the model of years ago. Another influence is that concerns about the environment will force manufacturers to extend product life cycles to reduce the amount of pollution and waste. And, in some cases, regulation will need to be strengthened. Many societies are much more fluid and democratic, and the structure of companies is changing to reflect that. I think we're going to see a greater emphasis within companies on teams created with a specific project in mind. And when they're completed, the teams will be disbanded and new ones formed. More and more people see work as simply one part of their lifestyle, and not the most important one. And as the workforce is shrinking in some countries, businesses are having to compete for staff instead of being able to choose among a lot of applicants. Typical examples that will attract and retain staff are traditional ones like flexible hours and, something that has been made possible by advances in technology, remote working, with people based at their home, abroad, or almost anywhere they choose. Management styles will almost certainly continue to change. Senior managers will require a lot more than the efficiency that they've always needed. Above all, they'll need great skills in leadership so that their organization can initiate and respond to change in a fast-moving world where they face lots of competing requirements and potential conflicts. In most of the world, the senior managers of large businesses are mainly men in their 50s and 60s. The predominant style of management will almost certainly become more consultative and collaborative, caused, above all, by more women moving into senior management positions. Many of the changes are influenced by developments in the wider economy. The traditional emphasis of business was manufacturing, and of course the service sector is very important. But we shouldn't overlook the growing financial contribution of IP, that is, intellectual property. Some books and films generate enormous sums from the sale of related DVDs, music, games, clothes, and so on. Another point I'd like to make is that although I've been talking about companies, one trend that they have to face is the move away from people working for the same employer for years. Instead, more and more people are becoming self-employed to gain the freedom and control over their lives that they're unlikely to get from being employed. Okay, well, that's all I want to say, so let's open it up for discussion.
Okay, and welcome back. During the short break we just took, several of you approached me with questions. So before going on with the orientation talk, I'd like to address those queries. As I found, if one person asks a question, probably a dozen others are wondering about the same thing. The first question is whether Wasamata University employs modules technology as an instruction method. The answer is yes, we do. At least that's what the university catalogue says. If some of you don't understand what modules technology is, don't worry. I googled the word but couldn't find it. Apparently though, it's a method of broadband wireless access. At least that's what an American company's website told me. But again, don't worry. If you need to know something more, your professor can tell you. Another question someone asked me was what tomorrow's workshop on research methods and skills was about. Well, research skills include any method you can imagine for finding and presenting any information you need. That's not just schoolwork either. Writing English, the native language for most of you, and finding a job are also research skills. And yes, those will be addressed in tomorrow's workshop. As you know, Wasamata University is one of this country's premier universities for the study of the dismal science, economics. Some of you, it seems, want to get a jump on their classmates. During the break, half a dozen of you came up and asked me where to find economics tomes. I know it's odd, but this school's library holdings are divided up between two libraries. Economics books are in the old library. If you look out of the window behind me, you can see it. It's the red brick building. Oh, before I forget, you economics types also need a lot of math, am I right? Well, those math books are neither in the old library nor in the new one. They can be found in the math department building. Why am I telling you this? Doesn't the invisible hand guide economists? Maybe it's good you asked. In 2008, that hand shoved most of the world economy off a cliff, didn't it? Now, I realize that most of you couldn't bring a computer printer or a photocopier from home. So I'm sure you're already wondering where you can copy things like term papers, internet articles, and things like that. I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that there are a number of places you can make copies. These include both libraries and the Student Union building. Now the bad news. I'm sorry to say, most classroom buildings and academic departments do not have copiers students can use. So most of the large buildings you see around campus do not have copiers for students. The copiers there are reserved for professors and office staff. Oh yes, I nearly forgot to tell you, if you need to have printing done, all the copiers available to students are laser printers. Plus, for your convenience, you can pay using prepaid cards. You can get those in the Student Union building. That just covers the questions put to me. If you have more, please see me during the next break at 2:15. Right now though, I'd like to start to give you a rundown on the various facilities here on campus. That way you won't get lost so easily in the weeks to come. I've been told that this year's incoming class features a large number of married students and parents, so you must be wondering where to put the baby while you're in class. Okay, right now we're in the Student Union building, right? Remember the big doors in front where you all came in? If you go out of the building, you can see the nursery is just on the other side of this building. It's only about 20 meters away. Convenient, eh? Next, we're all from different places around the country. Some of you are from other countries. That means we're pretty likely to get sick during the first months of school as we expose each other to many new viruses. So where's the doctor? Of course, you need to find the Medical Services Centre, which is on the right as you leave the building. Remember, that's the second building on the right. And if you look out of that window, you can see a lot of antenna and satellite dishes on the roof. So that's what we call the Media Centre. Yeah, I know, I think it's confusing too. The Media Centre is next to the Medical Centre. The chairwoman of the journalism school on the first floor doesn't like it when people who wander in there mistake her for a nurse. Chances are you'll have at least one math class while you're here. That red building there, just outside to the left, is the math department building. I know, it looks about as old as the subject of math, but I assure you that the inside is equipped with state-of-the-art classroom equipment, including interactive chalkboards and surround sound in every room. Oh, can you see the back building there? Yes, behind the Media Centre. Quite new, isn't it? That's the new library, just decorated. They're back to back, you might say. If you look just to the left of it at the lower, older-looking building, you'll find the old library. It's nice and quiet, perfect for those marathon study sessions during exam week. Since the weather is so nice, why don't we stop looking at our maps, but go for a walk around the campus?
We all know about the role of carbon dioxide in causing global warming. Obviously, society needs to reduce the release of carbon dioxide, otherwise known as CO2. This gas comes from the burning of fossil fuels, such as coal and oil, and it is virtually impossible for society to prevent or even limit such activity. Our need for energy and power is just too great. Instead, a more practical idea is to collect the carbon dioxide from the burning process, for example, directly from the chimneys of power stations, and somehow prevent this gas from being released into the environment. To do that, you need to store it somehow, and that has to be essentially forever. It is perhaps for this reason that many believe that, rather than storing the carbon dioxide as a gas, it is better to react it with metal oxides, magnesium or calcium, which results in the formation of a hard carbonate material. The gas is, in effect, turned into a stable and unreactive solid, which can simply be dumped anywhere. This process actually occurs naturally, although very, very slowly, and is one cause of the surface limestone in the world. But this slow reaction speed is the problem. Even when enhancing this process through high temperature and pressure, or pre-treatment of the mineral, it is still far too slow to be economical. One other technique which has been suggested is to pump the gas to the bottom of the ocean, where it would react with compounds in the seawater, forming carbonic acid. However, this alternative has now been ruled out. The CO2 may be removed from the atmosphere, but the high oceanic acidity which would result raises its own set of problems, mostly with all the delicate life and the intricate food chains which exist there, some on which we ourselves depend, and that's something which no one wants to experiment with. Perhaps because of the lack of alternatives, the most commonly discussed solution to the problem of disposing of carbon dioxide is to pump the gas underground, a technique known as geosequestration. In this system, the CO2, for example, could be pumped into underground pockets within depleted oil wells or disused coal tunnels. This carries, however, three serious disadvantages, namely the risk of leaks, the considerable costs involved, and finally the unproven effectiveness. Let us look at those three disadvantages in detail. Firstly, there is the risk of leaks. Although the gas would be deep and sealed over by masses of rock and earth, the huge pressures in these spaces would turn the gas into a liquid state, capable of moving through rock fissures or faults. This could allow the gas to eventually be released to the surface. Since CO2 is heavier than air, and thus pushes oxygen aside, such leaks could result in the suffocation of thousands or tens of thousands of people, certainly not a consequence to be taken lightly. Natural CO2 leakage from volcanic buildup has already witnessed such deadly events. The other problem of geosequestration is the cost. The time and effort spent on materials and construction, primarily the pipework through which the gas would travel, does not come cheaply. So, if this system were to be implemented in, say, coal-fired power plants, the extra cost would have to be paid by the electricity user, whose bills would almost double as a consequence. Few people are prepared to pay this much simply to make a small dent on the effects of global warming. And this leads to the final problem. The most basic question is whether geosequestration actually reduces global warming. The problem here is that the energy needed to create and drive the sequestration process would require approximately a quarter of a coal-fired electricity plant's output. In other words, the plant would have to burn 1/4 more of its coal just to account for the sequestration of the carbon dioxide. And with coal producing other noxious pollutants, such as sulfur, ash, and heavy metals, the environment is hardly benefited at all. Nevertheless, there are many active experimental efforts underway, primarily in oil production sites. These are small, but intensively monitored and analysed. All we can say now is that the jury is still out on whether underground carbon storage will one day be feasible.
Hi everyone. This morning I'm going to talk to you about flea markets in England. At first we were surprised to learn that only 15% of people here in England make an effort to collect waste. That is lower than other European countries. Also, it might be falling within a couple of years' time unless the government makes a severe regulation for industries and local residences. The UK government's target means that by 2012 we must decrease our waste emissions by 45%. Compared with 2000. Local councils can offer support to meet that target by taking part in the National Green Campaign and investing in local flea markets. Most of all, these markets reduce waste emissions from landfill sites. A flea market, or swap meet, is a type of bazaar where very cheap or second-hand goods are sold or bartered for. It may be indoors, like in a warehouse or school gymnasium, or it may be outdoors, like in a field or under a tent. The flea market vendors display the goods used on the table for selling, such as a few unwanted household items to operate commerce, including a variety of used living products. Many flea markets in European countries have food vendors who sell snacks and drinks to the visitors, and may be part of a small event such as carnivals or concerts. As part of our research, our team carried out a questionnaire with people in the local area. The results said, we need to open more second-hand shops. However, one problem is that there is a lack of information and marketing. To solve the problems, local councils should invest in support in flea markets by doing things like creating parking space, organising security, public promotions using the internet and other resources. We were also surprised to discover how waste such as furniture, computers, kitchen tools and other such things are reused, and wooden furniture or electronic products are easy to recycle, because they can be reused over and over again without becoming weaker. Around 3 million electronic goods are thrown away per year. Also, around 500,000 pieces of furniture are also disposed of. Only 1/5 is collected and fortunately recycled through many local flea markets. In 2009, there were around 3,000 flea markets in England. The number is increasing steadily so far. Surprisingly, by collecting under 15% of old books, lots of paper is imported, so more paper can be recycled in the UK. Europe recycles 50% of its paper, and Germany recycles 80% of its paper. When recycling launched, there were quality problems, so it was so hard to reuse paper in office sheets. However, these problems have now been solved, and Union of the Flea Markets based in East London produces high-quality recycled paper. Another union, Loving Paper, currently sells the paper that has been through a sorting process to farmers or gardeners as fertilizer. So, to sum up, there seems to be a number of activities that enable people to reuse waste, but the substantial problem is encouraging people to think twice about taking their waste to a flea market instead of throwing it away. I think the recycling program will make us save materials and protect the environment in future.
Perhaps the most recognizable symbol of China and its long and vivid history, the Great Wall of China is one of the most extensive construction projects ever completed. Somewhat ironically though, the one monument that China built to keep foreigners out is actually now the biggest tourist attraction in the country. Despite the initial purpose, the Great Wall never effectively prevented invaders from entering China. It came to function more as a psychological barrier between Chinese civilization and the world, and remains a powerful symbol of the country's enduring strength. Though the beginning of the Great Wall of China can be traced to the 3rd century BC, many of the fortifications included in the wall date from hundreds of years earlier, when China was divided into a number of individual kingdoms during the so-called Warring States period. Around 220 BC, Qin, the first emperor of a unified China, ordered that earlier fortifications between states be removed, and a number of existing walls along the northern border be joined into a single system that would extend for more than 10,000 li and protect China against attacks from the north. A li is about 1/3 of a mile, and that's where the monument's name came from. The original name for the Great Wall is Long Wall of 10,000 li, or simply the Long Wall. Though the wall is quite inspiring, it was never called the Great Wall in Chinese, and only foreign mistranslation with romantic overtones refer to it as Great or Big Wall. With the death of Qin and the fall of his dynasty, much of the Great Wall fell into disrepair. Much later, a series of frontier tribes seized control in northern China. The most powerful of these was the Northern Wei dynasty, which repaired and extended the existing wall in 390 AD to defend against attacks from other tribes. Despite its long history, the Great Wall of China as it exists today was constructed mainly during the mighty Ming dynasty, from 1368 to 1644. Under the strong hand of the Ming rulers, Chinese culture flourished, and the period saw an immense amount of construction in addition to the Great Wall, including bridges, temples and pagodas. In earlier centuries, the wall held little importance for the Mongols as a military fortification, and mostly served to protect caravans traveling along the profitable trade routes. But during the Ming dynasty, the Great Wall was considered vital to the defense of the country. Before the use of bricks, the Great Wall was mainly built from stones, wood, and rammed earth. However, during the Ming dynasty, bricks were heavily used in many areas of the wall. The size and weight of the bricks made them easier to work with than earth and stone, so construction quickened. Additionally, bricks could bear more weight and endure better than earth and wood. But many western sections of the wall are constructed from mud, and thus are more susceptible to erosion. That's why in many locations the Great Wall is in disrepair. A report by the State Administration of Cultural Heritage states that almost 1/5 of the wall has totally vanished. In places, the height of the wall has been reduced from more than 5 meters to less than 2 meters. And more than 60 kilometers of the wall in Gansu province may disappear in the next 20 years, due to frequent sandstorms. However, the state does its best to preserve and extensively renovate the Chinese wall, which makes a considerable figure upon the terrestrial globe. Due to its imposing sizes, the wall is often believed to be visible from the moon. But it's only a rumor. The width of the Great Wall, viewed from the moon, is about the same as that of a human hair, viewed from 2 miles away. In other words, to see the wall from the moon would require superhuman eyesight. Today, the monument attracts thousands of national and foreign tourists every day. In 1987, UNESCO designated the Great Wall a World Heritage Site. And now the Great Wall is generally recognized as one of the most impressive architectural feats in history.
I'm Professor Sam Richards, and I've come as the third guest lecturer on this course in Australian birds of prey. My job is to keep a watchful scientific eye on the state of Tasmanian peregrines, so I'll start by giving you some background to these magnificent birds of prey before I speak briefly on my own project. Peregrine falcons are found on all continents with the exception of Antarctica, so don't go looking for them at the South Pole. They're found almost everywhere in Australia, and it's interesting to note that the name peregrine implies that they're wanderers, that they move from place to place following the seasons, and indeed in most parts of the world they're migratory birds. But not in Australia, however, where they prefer to stay in one place. They're known to be the world's fastest creature, and they have been tracked by radar diving down towards the ground at 180 kilometres an hour. However, a number of textbooks claim that their flight speed can go as high as 350 kilometres an hour, so there's still some dispute about just how fast they can actually fly. Female peregrine falcons, like all other Australian falcons, are larger than their male counterparts. In fact, the female is almost a third larger than the male in the case of peregrines. While she stays close to the nest to protect the eggs and the young chicks, the male is mostly occupied looking for food. Peregrines typically lay 2 or 3 eggs per nest, and after the eggs have hatched, when the chicks are about 20 days old, they start to fly. So they fly at a very young age. By the time they're just 28 days old, they've already reached full adult size. In other words, they're fully grown. Soon after this, at about 2 months after hatching from the egg, they leave the nest for good. From this point on, they're on their own. Unlike their parents, which have learned how to hunt, the young falcons are not good at feeding themselves, and so during the first year about 60% of them die. Once the birds have managed to live to breeding age, they're 2 years old, they generally go on to live for another 6 or 7 years. When we come across nests with young chicks, the first thing we do is catch the chicks before they're able to fly. We have to catch them at an early age. We then attach identification rings to their legs. These rings are made of colour-coded aluminium, and they allow us to identify the birds through binoculars later in their lives. Thirdly, because we need to know how many males and how many female chicks are being born, we note the sex of the chicks. Noting the sex of the birds is a vital part of our research, as I will discuss later. The next thing to do is to take a blood sample from the chicks. We take the blood sample so that we can check the level of pesticide in their bodies. Peregrine falcons can build dangerous quantities of pesticides in their bloodstream by feeding on smaller mammals, which in turn feed on crops grown on farms where pesticides are used. Finally, we check the birds thoroughly, really checking the birds for their general health. This whole process only takes a few minutes. In fact, most of our time in the field is actually spent trying to find the nests, not on the data collection itself. Well, that's all I have for you today. If you'd like to do some further reading...
We begin our examination of America in the 1960s with the usual caution. There is no sense in trying to understand any decade without looking at what came before. Those of you who still have outstanding coursework on the 1950s would do well to complete it now, if for no other reason than it will help make sense of the next series of lectures. But we must press on, and I'd like to begin my talk about the 60s with a reference to one of those things that came before, the post-war baby boom. With the end of the Second World War in 1945, there began in the USA an era of perceived prosperity and security. In short, people started to feel that the world was a much better and safer place to bring up children. So, at the start of the 60s, all those children born in the baby boom, 70 million in the US alone, were teenagers. As the 60s progressed, and as this large number of people approached adulthood, there was a noticeable shift in the balance of power, and young people began to have a voice in ways that were not considered possible in the more conservative atmosphere of the preceding decade. Things were moving forward at a rapid pace. The literature of the time brought out all the taboos. Everything was covered, such as race in, for example, the book To Kill a Mockingbird. The role of women changed, and equality for women. Well, let's just say that once certain books were published, women were no longer going to be satisfied with their roles as devoted wives and mothers. Through literature alone, the whole fabric of society was challenged, and by the end of the 60s, things would never again be as they had pretty much been for the preceding 40 years. It was a decade of protest, civil rights protests, feminism, the rights of minorities, the Vietnam War. All these causes led to peaceful and not-so-peaceful protests on college campuses and elsewhere. People had been given freedom of speech and they were going to use it. The crime rate rose to 9 times what it was in the 50s, as respect for the old order faded away. But it was also a time of great development. In medicine, the 60s saw the first heart transplant. In technology and the space race, where we saw the first American in orbit and lasers being invented at the start of the decade, and the first man on the moon, and the first primitive internet at the end. None of this, good or bad, might have happened if things in 1962 had gone slightly differently. On October 16th, President John F. Kennedy met with his closest advisors at the White House. They had obtained photographic evidence showing that Cuba was building or installing nuclear weapons. It was widely believed that Cuba was preparing to fire these weapons at cities in the USA. Kennedy was faced with 3 choices: to try to resolve the crisis diplomatically by negotiating with Cuba and the Soviet Union, to take action to block the delivery of more weapons into Cuba, or to attack Cuba, destroying their weapons. Believing that the first option would end in failure and that the third option would lead to war, it was the second option that Kennedy chose. In doing so, he succeeded in preventing the buildup of more missiles. The Soviet Union then withdrew the weapons from Cuba. Most historians agree that if Kennedy had acted differently, the episode would have led to a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Millions would have died, and the world would have been changed beyond recognition.
Welcome to the Magic Earth. I'm Christine. Today we have invited a geographer, Andrew Fleming, the leader from the British Antarctic Survey, to give us an introduction about using satellite to map Antarctic sea ice. Welcome, Andrew Fleming.
Thank you, Christine. Well, as you know, cruising in the Southern Ocean isn't always plain sailing. But as it is becoming important to find better ways of navigating safely and avoiding future collisions because of the increasing visitorships, the Antarctic Polar View project is using satellites to map the sea ice to help ships find the best way in the vast white continent. There are very large lumps of heavy ice in the water which might look beautiful and white with penguins dancing on top of it, but I believe you do not want to hit it very fast with a ship. Otherwise your ship will be damaged, and therefore navigating through it is an important problem, not only in terms of the safety of the ship, but in terms of the speed of the ship and the efficiency of the ship. So you could have another choice, for example, take a quicker and cheaper route rather than spending an excessive amount of time going through an area of very thick ice. The quickest way to travel is to clear water channels, but it is a difficult task to find these routes. The area we're dealing with is absolutely enormous. The only way of monitoring that area of ocean effectively is by using satellites. Therefore, we use a satellite named the NVSAT, which is a satellite that collects information and picks up differences in ocean surface roughness, and that helps us to see the difference between open water and the sea ice. Radar allows the Antarctic team to see straight through the clouds down to the surface of the sea. With detailed images, it's even possible to see cracks in the surface, which can lead to dangerous ice falls. Wherever possible, we would use helicopters quite a lot and put them up in the air to map the ice and look for where we might find what we call leads, which are large areas of clear water that the ship might be able to move through. But it is certainly a much more difficult and time-consuming operation.
So does the image that you get from the polar view map give a good description of what you're actually seeing out there on the sea?
Yes, it does. We cannot yet know clearly about the thickness of the sea ice. But one of the science researchers that we were doing last summer was looking at doing some of that work using satellites as well. So that's going to be quite an exciting development. The map was coloured in various shades of grey, but it didn't take long to spot the difference between the dark, smooth open water and light, textured areas of sea ice. The first step is to take the image merely, which has to be sent to the ship.
How about others?
Internet connection in the Antarctic and on ships is notoriously poor, and that has meant that we have to compress the image a lot, cut a lot, and delete some of the details in the image as a result.
Have you solved the problem?
Yes. The normal way that we are doing this is by compressing the images into a format known as JPEG 2000. JPEG 2000 allows us to, number one, compress the imagery a lot more, and secondly, it allows us to maintain the geographic position of the image, so it knows where the image is and allows us to position that on a map.
And how long does this take?
I tested this in January over a very narrow dial-up satellite connection, and it took a few minutes. Sure, for us it is an enormous achievement. I mean, we now know fairly well the kind of sea ice conditions we are likely to encounter, so it is a fantastic and useful system. We just need a laptop on the ships.
That's great. Good morning, class. In the last few lectures, I've talked about the history of technology in the business area, but today I want to use Samuel Cunard as our case study, who was a shipping magnate that founded the Cunard Line. Now, Cunard was born in Canada. When he first left home, he was still a teenager. Then he came into a US company as a worker and learned how to sail there. During the War of 1812, Cunard volunteered for service in the 2nd Battalion of the Halifax Regiment Militia and rose to the rank of captain. He held many public offices, such as volunteer fireman and lighthouse commissioner, and maintained a reputation as not only a shrewd businessman, but also an honest and generous citizen. When he went to England, his friends cooperated with him, and together they coined a shipping company. The company had instant wealth and could deal with more than one cargo, for its major business was in North America and the Atlantic. From then onwards, Cunard became a highly successful entrepreneur in British shipping and one of a group of 12 individuals who dominated the affairs of England. In 1838, the British government, impressed by the advantages of steam sailing for making regular passages, invited tenders to carry the transatlantic mails by steamer. Back then, mail contact through steamships brought more punctuality, while other types of ships were always delayed. The journey times were flexible, with a transatlantic crossing lasting for 6 weeks and with no fixed times of departure or arrival. So it was never known when the mail would arrive, or, since so many sailing ships foundered, whether it would arrive at all. What Cunard wanted, in line with the thrusting new technology of the Victorian age, was a maritime extension of the brand, new timetabled railways on land. Cunard's experience in steamship operation, with observations of the growing railway network in England, encouraged him to explore the creation of a transatlantic fleet of steamships, which would cross the ocean as regularly as trains crossed land, and that's why he went to the United Kingdom seeking investors in 1837. He set up a company with several other businessmen to bid for the rights to run a transatlantic mail service between the UK and North America for £55,000 annually for 10 years. The bid was successful. Almost at the same time, Cunard cooperated with an English businessman and established the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, the ancestor of the Cunard Line. In 1840, the company's first steamship sailed from Liverpool to Boston, Massachusetts, with Cunard and 63 other passengers on board, marking the beginning of regular passenger and cargo service. Establishing a long, unblemished reputation for speed and safety, Cunard's company made ocean liners a success in the face of many potential rivals who lost ships and fortunes. Cunard's ships proved successful, and he then opened many branches, but the high costs saddled Cunard with heavy debts by 1842, so some of them went bankrupt. But what Cunard needed then was a port. After a lot of consideration, he finally opted for Boston because he was very familiar with this city where he had once worked it. Fortunately, by 1843, Cunard's ships were earning enough to pay off his debts and begin issuing modest but growing dividends. But the city did more than give Cunard silverware. Winters can be tough here in Boston. For example, in the year of 1844, one ship sank because of the winter freeze. The ship hit icebergs and caused a heavy loss to the company. Then, the board recommended the company to move to New York, and it was a huge success, and then became one of the biggest US shipping companies. Cunard himself made safety his priority, and to this day, Cunard has never been responsible for the loss of a single passenger or a single mail bag on the Atlantic run. Cunard's conservative nature enabled his company to see off rivals and to take a measured and steady approach when it came to the introduction of new technology like radio communication. In the early years of his career, Cunard took a prominent part in community activities and various charitable organisations, as well as mercantile affairs which extended throughout the Atlantic provinces. Back then, there were hardly any entertainment facilities on board. In order to make sure that the passengers could have a comfortable journey, newspapers were printed on board. Cunard was gratefully remembered for employing his capital in shipbuilding activities in the hard times of the 1830s because this enterprise had circulated money where there would otherwise be poverty and stagnation. His competitiveness and his obsession not to waste time were important characteristics of his personality. Prior to 1912, the shipping line had focused on speed and soon was renowned for its velocity and safety. Although early in life Cunard was imperious, he learned diplomacy and became a skillful and persuasive negotiator. His contemporaries admired him for the contribution to transatlantic communication by the line popularly called by his name. After that, for affluent transatlantic passengers, Cunard brought new levels of luxury to ocean travel. Lavish suites, a swimming pool, gymnasium, ballroom, electricity, and more, just like that of luxurious hotels. Okay, so